Hi all, this channel is going to focus on the Edexcel Unit Superpower Relations and the Cold War from Paper 2. This series of short videos will aim to add in bits of key detail that the specification requires of you, whilst also asking important questions to keep your mind engaged with the content that you are actually studying. In this first video, we're going to be looking at the origins of the Cold War, with the exception of the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the consequences that followed that. Essentially, the Cold War was a period of time in which a series of conflicts broke out without either side actually fighting each other. Imagine this like a chess game where you have two players using the chess pieces to fight the battles. In this example, the chess pieces are policies, political discussions, near conflicts, and battles such as the Vietnam War and the expansion of influence from both key players. The consequences of the USA and USSR fighting in a hot war, if you like, are genuinely too worrying to discuss because it could have resulted in a nuclear fallout post 1949 when the USSR actually successfully tested their first atom bomb. And it's a conflict that arose out of the Second World War. Another way to interpret the Cold War is the fight between communism and capitalism. Now, it would take quite a long time to discuss the intricacies of all the differences between communism and capitalism. So we're just going to keep it brief. We'll be looking at three of the main differences between the two in terms of politics, the economy, and beliefs. So in communism, there's only one party and you can't vote to change that party or style of government. Whereas in a capitalist country, voters may participate in democratic elections to change their government every X amount of years. In terms of the economy, in a communist country, there's no such thing as private business or industry, with the exception of the new economic policy designed by Lenin in 1921 to kickstart the economy, but we're not going to go into that this video. In a capitalist country, however, businesses are allowed and most businesses are private there. In terms of their beliefs perhaps demonstrate the most profound differences between the two systems. There's a common thought that neither can coexist with the other, and to some extent some people still think that. In communism, it's thought that everyone is equal and there will be a worldwide revolution, whereas in a capitalist country, equality is it's preached, but it's kind of sketchy, as in we don't always see that equality. And also, in a capitalist country, there are vast differences in terms of wealth. So, origins of the Cold War and the leaders. Looking at the big three of the Grand Alliance, who can be said to be the authors of the Cold War, if you like. We've got Joseph Stalin on the far left. He went into these discussions believing that the West ultimately wanted to remove communism, and having fought for communism in Russia his whole life, he went into these discussions prepared to be quite stern. Then we move to Franklin Roosevelt, who wholeheartedly believed in democracy. However, he was willing to compromise and make peace with the USSR in order to end the war in Europe and Asia. Then we have Churchill on the far left. He was the Conservative Prime Minister of the UK, and he was a huge advocate for the British Empire and its overseas colonies, much to the dislike of Roosevelt, who felt that in some cases Britain's colonies overseas were more dangerous than the USSR. Okay, and he was also really suspicious of the communists. This is Churchill, sorry. He was really suspicious of the communists and wanted to limit communist expansion as much as physically possible. So what did the Grand Alliance actually agree to? We're going to be looking at three conferences. The first was in Tehran, November 1943. What was agreed? So the USA and Britain would open a second front by launching an attack on Germany in Western Europe. Stalin would declare war against Japan. There would be an informal discussion about what would happen post-Germany, and an international body should be established. How did this change relationships between the Grand Alliance? So, as we've already said, Stalin went into these discussions expecting to be opposed. So when he found out, or when it was agreed that a second front would be opened against Germany, he was quite surprised and quite happy about that. Churchill was less pleased about this. He wanted a second front to be opened in the Balkans, not Germany. And as we've already said, Roosevelt viewed British colonialism as more of a threat to world peace than the USSR. Then we move on to Yalta, the second of the three conferences, which took place nearly 2 years later, February 1945. So, Post-World War II, Germany would be divided into 4 zones, owned by the USA, USSR, Britain and France. Germany would pay $20 billion reparations, and half of this, or roughly half of this, would go to the USSR on account of the amount lost from the USSR. The UN would be set up. Stalin did join the war against Japan. Stalin also agreed that Eastern European countries could participate in free elections, though we're going to see that this was a little bit sketchy, and the Polish borders would return to the position of 1921. The reason why that final point is quite significant is it gives massive land contributions to the USSR. Stalin's really happy about this because twice in his lifetime, Russia has been invaded by Germany, so he's happy to have that buffer zone, if you like. Now, before we talk about Potsdam, which is the 3rd and final conference, which takes place at the end of July, beginning of August 1945, we need a little bit of context. Roosevelt dies that year in April, unfortunately, and he's replaced by Harry S. Truman. Now, this transition isn't very smooth. Roosevelt kept international politics and policies quite close to the chest. He didn't really discuss this with his vice president. So when Harry Truman comes to the table, he hasn't really had a lot of involvement in what's gone on in the 2 previous conferences. Churchill and the Conservative Party lost the 1945 general election, and the new Prime Minister is Labour's Clement Attlee. Germany had surrendered in May of that year, but the war in Japan is still ongoing, and scientists in the USA have developed the atom bomb. So how does this change? So let's go to the actual conference, what was agreed. So as was agreed in the previous conference, Germany is divided into 4 zones, but with a slight twist. Berlin, so the capital, which is deep in the USSR zone, this gets divided also into 4 zones between the 4 countries mentioned above, and reparations would be taken from their own zones. This was one of Truman's ideas because he didn't want a repeat of what happened after the Treaty of Versailles was signed, in terms of Germany being unable to pay the reparations back. So he was very clear that reparations needed to be taken from their individual zones. How did this change relationships? So Truman was very clear in his mistrust and desire to be tough on communism. He was very clear on that. Clement Attlee, he didn't really want to prolong these discussions because his main focus was back in Britain, back home. But it wasn't all bad. Despite some disagreements and the testing of the atom bomb from the USA, they did find some common ground. So that brings us to the end of this video. So just 3 key questions for you to think about using the knowledge that you've just gained. So how might the political changes and conflicting personalities of the conferences lay the foundation for the rest of the war? This wants you to focus on the changing of administration from the USA and the USSR. Just how quickly things can change like that. How might that lay the foundation for the rest of the Cold War? Number 2, to what extent did changes in leadership dictate the outcome of these conferences? And finally, what would you state are the most profound consequences of the conferences that we've discussed? Don't forget, consequences don't necessarily have to be a bad thing either. Okay, thank you for watching and join us next time.